In 1995, Carolyn Killaby of Vancouver, Washington, got into a heated argument with her husband. She then went to a local bar alone. No one has seen or heard from her since. But some saliva from an envelope and a speck of blood on a wristwatch helped solve the mystery of her disappearance. In 1990, Carolyn and Dan Killaby were married, each for the second time. Dan managed a furniture store. Carolyn was a medical technician employed by the U.S. military. Carolyn and Dan each had a daughter from their previous marriages, and they moved into this home in Vancouver, Washington.
My mom was basically the backbone of my whole family. I mean, she was very strong-willed, and she held everybody together. She was the problem solver, she was the supporter, she was the happiness, the joy. She was just like everything you could ask for.
On Saturday night, November 11th, 1995, Carolyn and Dan got into an argument.
She'd been in a fight with her husband because her husband had decided, instead of doing something with her that night that she'd counted on, they were going to go out. He was going to go out with his brother and have some food and drink. And she objected significantly to that. And I don't know whether she stomped out of the house and drove over there or how that transpired, but she ended up at Omar's and she was doing some serious drinking there.
A waitress said Carolyn was dancing, but was there alone and was obviously intoxicated.
The other indication was that she was alone at the table and that her head was down and that she had her head on the table and was basically passed out at the table, not functioning, not talking to anyone. Very, very clear to everyone in the bar that she was highly intoxicated.
That night, around 11 o'clock, witnesses said they saw Carolyn leave the bar, and she was never seen again.
I came home Sunday morning and she was gone.
The next day, Dan Killaby called police to report Carolyn missing. Family members, friends, and volunteers searched the surrounding area without success.
I knew that she would not leave unless somebody made her. There was no way she would have left us.
She is really the light of the family. Her personality, her kindness. Sorry.
Carolyn's car was found in the bar's parking lot. The Killaby family hired their own search dogs. The dogs tracked Carolyn's scent from the bar directly back to her home. The police believed this might be evidence that Carolyn returned home from the bar before she disappeared. No one else was home that night. Dan and the two girls spent Saturday night elsewhere.
They were concerned about whether or not Dan's alibi that he was out drinking with his brother was solid, and I think that they stayed out real late and got real drunk. And so the police were not 100% convinced that that could have been the case.
Creating further suspicions was the fact that Carolyn had a $230,000 life insurance policy payable to her husband.
I always stood behind Dan. There was no doubt that I could never conceive the idea that he had actually done something like this.
Dan Killaby denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance, but police discovered there were problems in the marriage.
We found out that it wasn't the perfect marriage by any stretch of the imagination. I think we figured that there were some difficulties and some strains in the marriage.
2 hours after Carolyn left the bar, the police received 2 calls from people who said they heard a woman screaming for help in a field about a mile from Omar's lounge. Police searched the area using night vision goggles, but they found nothing. With no solid leads, the Killaby family offered a $10,000 reward for any information on Carolyn's whereabouts. And then, a bombshell. A customer at Omar's lounge said he saw Dan Killaby with Carolyn in the parking lot on the night she disappeared. When 34-year-old Carolyn Killaby didn't return home after spending a night drinking at a local bar, her husband Dan was an immediate suspect. Prosecutor David Seeley says there's an old saying in missing persons cases: before you look at outlaws, you have to look at the in-laws.
One of the things they look at to begin with is a husband in a missing person case like this, because I think a large percentage of the crimes are committed by family members.
Police found no evidence of foul play in the Killaby home. But in Carolyn's bedroom, they found some potent painkillers, Vicodin.
My sister was having some problems with prescription drug medication, and I had confronted her and talked to her about that. She had acknowledged the problem and was working on that. The whole family was being supportive of that.
My understanding of the mixture of alcohol and Vicodin is it makes you comatose, and that's exactly what happened to Carolyn when she was in the bar.
Witnesses at Omar's lounge say that Carolyn passed out at her table. One of the regular customers, Dennis Smith, helped her to her car. What Smith told police was disturbing. He said that he and Carolyn left the bar and engaged in consensual sex in his truck. As he walked her to her car, a man approached them, hit Smith with a bat, called Carolyn a bitch, and forced her to leave with him. When shown a photographic lineup, Smith identified Carolyn's husband, Dan, as the culprit. Dan Killaby angrily denied this. He offered to take a lie detector test and passed. Dan Killaby said he and his brother were out drinking together that night in a bar, which the bartender there confirmed. When police looked closer into Dennis Smith's background, they discovered that Smith had been convicted for the murder of his sister, Patricia Ann Johnson, in 1982. Smith served 10 years of that sentence and had recently been released on parole. And a witness told police that she saw mud on Smith's truck on the night Carolyn disappeared.
He came to a Shell station in Clark County. His truck was all dirty. He asked the attendant there, who was a friend, whether or not he could go to her parents' house and wash his car.
The employee also thought she saw a blood smear on Smith's shirt. With this new information, Smith's truck was confiscated, and police noticed that the inside of the truck had been wiped clean. No fingerprints, hairs, or fibers, even though Smith said Carolyn had been in the truck for consensual sex. Investigators did find a tiny speck of blood on the steering wheel. And there was evidence of a recent fire. Smith said a cigarette butt accidentally ignited the upholstery. An alert homicide investigator also confiscated Smith's wristwatch. In the forensics lab, scientists found a tiny speck of what appeared to be blood in the crevice of the wristband. Tests indicated it was human, but whose was it? Since we get half of our DNA from our mother and half from our father, scientists could identify whether it was Carolyn's blood in the truck by analyzing DNA samples from Carolyn's parents. But Carolyn's mother delivered some shocking news. Despite raising Carolyn as his own, the man Carolyn called Dad wasn't her biological father, a fact withheld from Carolyn during her upbringing. Carolyn's biological father had died years earlier. This made the blood stain analysis much more difficult.
We didn't have any solid DNA. We didn't have a piece of skin or a blood sample from her body that we could compare to the blood stain. So we were a little up in the air about what to do.
Without a body, scientists would have to improvise. When Dennis Smith learned that he was a suspect in Carolyn Killaby's disappearance, he fled, and a nationwide manhunt was underway.
We didn't know who she'd left with. We had the thought that maybe she was in a hotel in Angry. And then we found out that she had been seen leaving with this guy Dennis, and so we didn't know what that meant. And then we found out that he was a murderer that had been out on parole, and so that took away some hope.
While the FBI searched for Smith, forensic scientists analyzed his truck. Arson experts discovered hydrocarbons on the upholstery of Smith's truck. Hydrocarbons are present when an accelerant or flammable liquid is used to start a fire. A clue that the fire was intentionally set. The damage was extensive, and Smith's story didn't match the evidence.
We got a similar car seat. We tried to recreate the fire in 3 or 4 different ways. And each time we couldn't come up with that type of damage that we saw in his car.
In a small crack in the steering wheel, a phenolphthalein test identified a tiny stain as blood. And on Dennis Smith's wristband, scientists found another speck of blood. But without Carolyn's body, scientists had no DNA sample for comparison. So detectives searched for a sample of Carolyn's DNA, and they found it in Alaska. 10 years earlier, Carolyn mailed a letter to her girlfriend in Alaska, and her friend had never thrown it away. On the envelope flap and stamps was Carolyn's saliva, still a rich source of DNA even after 10 years. The samples were too badly degraded for traditional DNA testing, so scientists used a newer and less exact DNA test called mitochondrial DNA. Traditional DNA testing analyzes the nucleus of the cell, but outside the cell nucleus are what are known as mitochondria, cells that can be identified, although not as precisely as in traditional DNA testing.
Mitochondrial DNA is inherited from a mother to her children, and therefore if you want to make a match between a sample of evidence from a missing person, as was in this case, blood stains from someone whose body was not available, you need only go to a maternal relative.
The DNA from the envelope flap and stamps matched the DNA from the blood found in Smith's truck. And with DNA samples from Carolyn Killaby's mother and daughter, Dr. Melton concluded that the mitochondrial DNA in Dennis Smith's truck was that of Carolyn Killaby. It was a DNA profile that existed in only 1 out of 200,000 Caucasians.
Because there was no body found in this case, and I believe the remains of Miss Killaby are still missing, it was very important to place her in the presence of Mr. Smith. And of course, a blood stain on his watch band that comes back to her would be very powerful evidence.
On the 1-year anniversary of Carolyn's disappearance, friends and relatives gathered for a candlelight vigil outside of Omar's lounge, the last place she was seen alive.
that I'm glad they're here, and I'm glad they want to show that they cared too.
For over a year, Dennis Smith had been on the run. Then the television series Unsolved Mysteries profiled the case, asking viewers for help in bringing Smith to justice. 4 days later, an anonymous tip revealed Smith was living in Florida. The trick now was to find him.
And I turned to drugs, and my stepdad turned to alcohol, and my sister turned away from all of us, and my whole family just fell apart. Everything that I'd known for 15, almost 16 years in one night was all unraveled.
For 15 months, Carolyn's family waited for some word on the search for Dennis Smith. Law enforcement searched all over the country, and an informant said Smith was living in Florida. Police there stopped a vehicle on the suspicion it was stolen. The man driving the car was Dennis Smith. Smith tried to get away. There was a fight, and Smith was shot in the scuffle.
I was hoping that he was in a lot of pain. I wanted him to hurt. I crossed my fingers, though, that he didn't die. As much as I hate him and do not want him in this world, if he were to die, there was really no hope of finding my mom's body or for him having to suffer in prison.
Smith survived the gunshot wound and returned to Washington State to stand trial for kidnapping, rape, and the murder of Carolyn Killaby, even though police still hadn't found her body. Smith pleaded not guilty and stood by his story that he was attacked by Carolyn's husband in the parking lot of the bar and that Carolyn left with her husband. The defense reminded the jury that Smith identified Dan Killaby from a photographic lineup. But prosecutors said Smith probably recognized Dan Killaby from television news reports about his wife's disappearance.
And it's just amazed me, and I see on TV, on court shows, on anything, real or not, how the defense always tries to twist the victims into this horrible person when they never did anything to ask for what they got, and they didn't deserve it.
Prosecutors believe that Carolyn Killaby was inebriated in Omar's lounge and that Smith offered to drive her home. Somewhere along the way, Smith raped and murdered Carolyn Killaby in the cab of his truck. Her blood spattered onto the steering wheel, Smith's watch, and probably on the upholstery. Prosecutors suspect that Smith buried Carolyn's body somewhere near Larch Mountain. A few hours later, a gas station attendant said she saw a blood stain on Smith's shirt and that his truck was full of mud. Smith attempted to remove the blood inside his truck with detergents. And when he couldn't remove it all from the upholstery, he set it on fire. But he missed a tiny speck of blood on his wristband and a tiny speck of blood on the steering wheel, proof that Carolyn Killaby had been bleeding inside his truck.
Some of his friends happened to be nurses. He went into a great detail with his nurse friends about what is DNA, how do you get rid of DNA. I used Pine Sol and Lysol and other cleaning agents in my car. Is that going to get rid of DNA? And the nurses said, hey, I don't think so.
Prosecutors also discovered that when Smith was in prison for killing his sister, he told his cellmate how he would get away with murder the next time.
Mr. Smith told an inmate that if he ever committed another murder, he would dispose of the body by digging a hole, placing the body in it, recovering the hole, and planting a tree on top of it so that no one would know that a body is under there.
And wherever she is, it's out in most likely a dark, cold place where we can't go and visit her physically, where her remains are.
He also told the inmate that he would dispose of the other evidence by burning it.
The only scientific evidence in this case was the mitochondrial DNA taken from 2 tiny specks of blood. Dennis Smith was found guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. After his conviction, Dennis Smith offered to disclose the location of Carolyn's body in return for some Taco Bell burritos and $10,000 in cash.
We obviously all know that he knows where the body is, and now he's trying to get something for him when he should do the right thing and give up Carolyn's body to give closure to this family. I think it's pathetic what he's trying to do now.
He's not getting any money. He already has more things in prison that we have. I mean, he has free cable, he has free pay-per-view. I mean, I have to pay for my cable, I have to go rent movies, and then he wants extra spending money. I mean, there's no way that I would give him a cent. I wouldn't give him a penny.
The Killaby family may never recover Carolyn's body for a proper burial, but they've purchased a burial plot with a headstone anyway. For Carolyn's daughter, Gina, not a day goes by when she doesn't think of her mother.
She has this beautiful new granddaughter that she never got the chance to meet and be a grandmother to. But that her granddaughter will always know who she is, and that she will always be a part of this family, and that we love her and miss her very, very much.
During the fall and winter of 1991, police searched all over New England for a woman who had disappeared from her home in Maine. Police were not sure whether she had run away or had met with foul play. 1 year later, investigators found a clue that had been right under their noses from the very beginning. Portland, Maine, the largest city in the state, and at one time, its capital. It's a deep water port on Casco Bay, an inlet to the Atlantic Ocean, which explains its role as a major fishing center. Pearl Smith worked as a fish packer. Every day, she boxed crates of fish for shipment around the country. It was hard work, with little pay. After work, she was a frequent customer at a bar near the docks. She was a regular there, as was Bill Bruns, a man 13 years her senior. Bruns was a trucker. His job was hauling fish from Maine to Montreal. The two had a lot in common. They liked to drink, and they were unlucky in love. Pearl had been divorced 5 times, and Bill's 3rd marriage had just ended. They fell in love and were married in the summer of 1986. Their relationship appeared to be close. They met for lunch each day at this restaurant on the docks. But on August 13th, 1991, Pearl's daughter called police to report her mother missing. She said Pearl failed to show up for a family gathering she had been looking forward to.
My mother was very loving, very caring, everybody's best friend. Gosh, like I said, she'd give her shirt off her back for anybody, you know, and she was always there when you needed her. She never let you down.
South Portland detective Linda Barker was assigned to the investigation. At the Bruns' home, she noticed that none of Pearl's clothing, jewelry, and personal items were missing. And her prized possession, a black Cadillac with vanity plates reading Pearl B, was still in the garage.
Pearl really loved her Cadillac, and she very rarely went anywhere with it without it. And that was one of the things that Elaine was very concerned about, that her mother left, but left her Cadillac behind.
The car being left behind in the garage said to me that my mother never left the home. If my mother had left the home, she would have been in the car.
So my daughter lives out of town and I have a few friends.
Bill Bruns told police that he and Pearl had an argument, and afterwards he left for Chinese food. When he returned home, Pearl was gone. But he said he wasn't worried, since she would occasionally leave with no explanation.
It was not unusual for Pearl to leave home for 2, 3, 4, even 7 days at a time. She would go and stay with friends in Old Orchard or with family members. So, yeah, it had happened in the past, and it was not unusual.
But with her car still in the garage, how did she leave? Police called the airlines, bus, and taxi services, and there was no evidence that Pearl Bruns had left town. Bill Bruns told police that his wife probably ran off with another man, and the police chief agreed.
Chief Swartz did not believe that my mother was a missing person. He believed that she was a drunk who may have possibly ran off with another man. He knew my stepfather, Bill Bruns, personally, and he believed that Bill was not the type of person that would do anything to hurt anybody. And he had made such a statement to Christine Young, the reporter, at one time.
He said, she was an alcoholic. She'd been married 6 or 7 times. She probably ran off with one of her ex-husbands. I said, well, what about her current husband? Could he be involved? He goes, nah, I've known him for 20 years. Couldn't be him.
Days passed, and then weeks, and Pearl Bruns' family feared they would never see her again. In the port city of Portland, Maine, police continued their search for 48-year-old Pearl Bruns.
Oh yeah, how about the phone bill?
Prosecutors were suspicious of Pearl's husband since he hadn't reported her missing.
Mr. Bruns' behavior in this case was peculiar. If you came home one day and found your wife was gone without any explanation, what would you do? What would any of us do?
Bruns did nothing. It was Pearl's daughter from a previous marriage who called police.
I knew that my mother would have been in contact with me, so there was no doubt in my mind that my mother was no longer alive. My mother was the type of person that would have gone to great lengths just to be able to contact me or my daughter.
Pearl's suitcase was found partially packed on her bed with high-velocity impact blood spatter on it, consistent with a striking blow to the head.
The blood that was on the suitcase, there was a high velocity blood spatter, low velocity, but also smears of blood on the suitcase, indicating that the blood came either from cast off of some kind or possibly during a struggle, somebody struck with a weapon of some kind.
In the days before her disappearance, Pearl Bruns spent an increasing amount of time in her favorite bar. She told friends that she and Bill were fighting mostly about money and that she was depressed. Once news of Pearl's disappearance hit the local media, tips poured into the police. One of Pearl's friends said he thought he saw her walking along the docks late at night, but none of the tips panned out. The case stalled, until 6 weeks later, when a hiker on the Appalachian Trail 200 miles away in New Hampshire found Pearl Bruns's purse.
The pocketbook was found right near where the body of another murdered woman had been found a year or two before that, in the exact same area. And that woman's murder, to this day, has never been solved.
All of my mother's identification and everything was in the purse. They described jewelry to me and stuff that was in the purse that was definitely my mother's.
A search of the area uncovered nothing more, but police now listed the case as a possible homicide.
I was thinking it might be possible that my mother's body was somewhere out there also.
It was laid there in open view with her personal belongings, driver's license, jewelry, and money inside the pocketbook, with blood spatter on the outside of the pocketbook. Somebody wanted us to find that pocketbook.
Meanwhile, Detective Barker went back to the Bruns home to question Bill Bruns further. When she entered the Bruns home, she noticed something new.
I remarked to Bill Bruns, "Gee, Bill, you've got new carpet." And he denied that. He said, no, this is the same carpet. And I said, well, you've had the carpet cleaned. And he said, no, I didn't have it cleaned. He said, I just sprinkled it with this rug refreshener and vacuumed it. And I was really astounded because it was sparkling clean.
Neighbors said they saw Bill Bruns struggling to get a carpet steam cleaner into his house. Why would Bruns lie to police about shampooing his carpet? Pearl's daughter confronted her stepfather with her suspicions.
I sat down with Bill one day at the kitchen table, and I spoke with him, and I told him, you know, Bill, you're the last one that saw my mother. You're the only one that would know what happened to her. And he just kind of sat there and looked at me and never said a word.
Police used cadaver dogs to search the Bruns home. The dogs are trained with a chemical formula called pseudocorpse, which mimics the smell of decaying flesh. Trained dogs will lie down when they detect the smell of a body. When Dr. Edward David led his dog Ray through the home, the dog headed immediately to the basement.
I could tell by the dog's attitude, by that I mean the position of the tail, the ears, that the dog was scenting. And the dog then circled around the crawl space several times, and then near the entrance to the crawl space, the dog lay down.
Detectives began to excavate the area identified by the dog, confident that the mystery of Pearl Bruns' disappearance had finally been solved. But to their astonishment, they found nothing. After months of searching for Pearl Bruns, the only clue to her disappearance was her purse found along a hiking trail 200 miles away in New Hampshire. A cadaver dog identified the scent of human remains in Pearl Bruns' basement, but the excavation turned up nothing. A serious setback for investigators.
The investigation was a frustrating investigation because it was going on for so long. At some point during these kinds of investigations, you do reach a conclusion just based on common sense. Things aren't right. This lady's dead, and we've got to prove what happened and who did it.
There was speculation that Pearl's body may have been dumped at sea or somewhere along the highway Bill Bruns traveled every week on his trucking route.
Bill drove refrigerated trucks. He hauled fish from Maine to Canada. In some of our minds, we thought, how perfect. What a perfect way to get rid of a body. You've got a refrigerated truck to stick it in. You haul it with the fish. There's plenty of blood anyway.
But you've got to remember, too, that with Bill's connections to fishermen on the dock and so on, that Mrs. Bruns could have been taken out to sea and dumped overboard in somebody's fishing boat.
Bill Bruns continued to maintain that his wife had run off with an ex-husband. But one of Pearl's friends revealed information that contradicted that.
She said, "There's one thing I want you to know." She says, "If anything should ever happen to me, you tell them that Bill did it." And I said, "Pearl, what are you talking about?" And then I just forgot about it.
So police got another warrant to search the Bruns' house. This time, they used a chemical reagent, luminol. When luminol is sprayed on an area where blood has been cleaned up with water and detergents, it glows or fluoresces. When it was applied inside the Bruns' home, the luminol told a horrifying tale. Cast-off blood spatter was evident on the walls and floor. Bloody footprints led towards the bathroom. Areas of the rug and linoleum floor showed where large amounts of blood had been spilled and later cleaned up. On the steps leading down to the basement, more blood. Each step indicated that a bloody object had been dragged downstairs. At the bottom of the stairs, some 4 feet across, was a large blood stain. Most alarming was a blood stain found in a 38 by 25-foot dirt crawl space. On the dirt floor was the blood pattern of a human body, the same height as Pearl Bruns. It was clear that large amounts of blood had been spilled and cleaned inside the Bruns' home, contradicting Bill's story that his wife had simply left.
No, you're involved, all right?
Detective Harriman confronted Bill Bruns with the luminol evidence.
And we asked Bill, what would you think, Bill? Who would you suspect would do or cause foul play to your wife? He said, I would suspect the husband.
You've been sitting here lying.
Bill Bruns continued to maintain his innocence, but when asked to take a lie detector test, he refused. Police were not sure what to do next. They had already excavated the basement floor once and had come up empty-handed. For the next 9 months, the investigation stalled. Until police learned of a new forensic tool, one they hoped would lead them to Pearl Bruns' body. Despite 3 separate searches and a prior excavation of the Bruns' basement, police were still convinced that the basement held the key to Pearl Bruns' disappearance.
We couldn't give up on the fact that there may be evidence down there, but to dig this entire basement by hand was virtually impossible.
Detective Harriman then learned about a new forensic tool called ground-penetrating radar. He called Harding ESE, a local environmental engineering firm who had the equipment. 13 months after Pearl Bruns' disappearance, the Bruns' basement was searched with the radar.
I'm afraid that they're going to find something, but I'm also hoping that they will, so that, it'll be over with. So we'll have some answers.
The technology is normally used to locate large metal objects buried in open fields. The GPR unit sends high-frequency radio waves into the ground. When the signals hit an obstruction, a buried storage tank for instance, the signal is reflected back up to the unit. But looking for a body created problems.
Human body obviously made up of primarily water, fatty tissues, flesh, bone. And in my experience, especially with this particular survey, is that the human body apparently did not conduct radio wave energy very well.
In the Bruns' basement, the radar detected a consistent reflection just 3 feet below the surface. A preliminary excavation revealed rust-colored oxidized sand. But there was another area that showed no reflection.
There was an area of whiteout on the record. there was nothing to see, meaning that something absorbed the energy. What it was, we don't know until we dig it up and get a look at it.
As Bill Bruns returned home from work, investigators began to excavate his basement once more.
We dig just a few shovelfuls, and it's at that point in time that I strike the plastic bag buried approximately 2 feet below the surface, which turned out to be the head encased in a plastic bag.
It was a badly decomposed human body, wrapped in 2 large garbage bags and tied with rope and tape. The individual was wearing a wristwatch with Pearl's name engraved on the face, and had pink shoelaces like the ones Pearl was last seen wearing. The stench of decomposition was overwhelming, and police walked upstairs to confront Bill Bruns for the last time.
Bill is sitting upstairs in his home in the kitchen area. He's eating a plate of spaghetti for supper at around 6 o'clock in the evening. We walk through the door, advise Bill, "You're under arrest, Bill, for the murder of your wife."
And the detective walks up to him and says, "Bill, come on, we're going." And Bill says, "Why?" He says, "You're under arrest, Bill." And Bruns says, "For what?" And he says, "Murder, Bill." Bill says, "Murder? That's a pretty strong word." And Pat goes, "Bill, that's a pretty strong smell."
When they unearthed the body, you know, you could smell the stench for miles. And he's upstairs in the house eating spaghetti, and when they come up to arrest him, he asked if he could finish his dinner before they took him away. So it just kind of shows, you know, what a sick individual he was.
Bill Bruns was arrested and charged with murder. X-rays showed 3 fractures to the left side of Pearl's face, but the skin was not torn, an indication that Pearl was struck with a fist.
What do you think you're doing?
Getting out of here.
You're not going anyplace.
Prosecutors believe that on August 11th, Bill and Pearl argued about money, and the fight became physical. He struck her 3 times with enough force that the cast-off blood spatter landed on Pearl's suitcase, on the wall, and on the floor. As she lay on the floor, Pearl bled to death. Bill then packed the body into plastic bags and carried her to the basement. The luminol revealed the path clearly and shows where her body lay as he dug the grave. The cadaver dog was correct about the body in the basement, and the location he identified was only a few feet away from the actual burial spot. Police believe that in an attempt to throw off the investigation, Bill Bruns took Pearl's purse and left it 200 miles away on a hiking trail in New Hampshire. Bill Bruns pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
Without developments in forensic science, such as luminol, ground-penetrating radar, which were used to great effect in this case, I think it is highly likely that Bill Bruns would have gotten away with murder.
Ironically, during the autopsy on Pearl Bruns' body, the pathologist found that she had terminal cancer and would have lived only another 6 months.
If he had just been patient, my mother would have died of natural causes anyway, and he wouldn't be sitting in jail now. And I just see it as my mother getting the last laugh on him because, like I said, if he had just been patient, she would have died on her own.
In 1989, a 4-year-old girl was rushed to a Texas hospital. An artery in her leg was completely severed. The little girl died shortly after arrival. Medical investigators believed the leg wound was no accident. Emory, Texas is a small farming community about 90 miles east of Dallas. With a population of less than 1,000, life is simple here. Peaceful and quiet. In 1988, Debbie Lovelace and her 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Amy and April, moved in with John Miller. He too was divorced and worked in the construction industry.
My marriage with John was good. He was a very good man. Took care of me and the kids real well. And we had a happy home life.
We had a lot of fun together. The children, we did a lot of things with the children. We didn't leave them home when we went somewhere, so we took them with us. And had a family, a very close-knit family, really.
John, Debbie, and the 2 girls moved onto a 5-acre farm just a few miles outside of town. It was complete with a house, barn, horses, and family pets. And for the children, freedom to roam and play among the beauties of nature. 4-year-old April loved living on a farm.
She loved to play outside. She loved, you know, being outside, and she liked to climb trees a lot. So I had a time keeping her out of trees.
And she was just bubbly. I mean, she was just full of life. She just got into everything. She's always running. I don't think she knew how to walk. She just ran everywhere. Just a bundle of fun.
Just after Christmas, on January 4th, 1989, the couple's older daughter Amy headed for school. April went outside to play. Debbie did her chores. John was working on an old building on the corner of the property. Around noon, Debbie called for April to come home for lunch, but there was no response. Then John came running towards the house carrying April, who was bleeding profusely from a severe leg wound.
And she didn't have any clothes on. And I couldn't do anything but scream. I was hysterical. I mean, I was just, because she was just black and blue all over, and I could see it at a distance, you know, and it was just, it was horrible.
Her right leg fell open, and there was a large gash in it all the way to the bone. I knew that this was a serious, very serious wound. When she had already bled out, she has a very small amount of time in which to get help and survive.
Even though John was a trained paramedic, there was little he could do. April had lost too much blood. The 4 by 6 inch gash in April's leg had torn away a large portion of her femoral artery.
It was just that, it was like that whole section of her leg was just gone. It was just like it had been ripped out.
Doctors did everything they could to save April's life, but the damage was just too great.
And it was just, she had went through too much, and she went into a second shock. And she just couldn't make it.
4-year-old April died on the operating room table. John told police that he found his stepdaughter nude under a tree and bleeding profusely from a leg wound. According to John, April said, "The dogs did it." The sheriff ordered an autopsy. The suspicion was murder. John Miller said his daughter April, before her death, told him that the dog caused her fatal leg wound. The local sheriff's department suspected foul play. Journalist David Hanners covered this story for the Dallas Morning News.
They had a dead child on their hands, so they needed to investigate it, and I think their immediate thinking was someone killed her.
During the autopsy, the pathologist noticed long vertical marks and puncture wounds all over April's body, which he believed were indicative of some form of abuse. And he saw no indication that April's leg wound was caused by a dog, since the wound did not have the jagged edges often seen in animal bites. The wound was cleanly cut, and the pathologist concluded it had been made by a knife. His finding was that April had been murdered. As John and Debbie returned from April's funeral service, they faced a full-scale investigation.
The police were everywhere. I don't know exactly how many, but there was people everywhere, walking everywhere and going through the house and walking everywhere outside.
I said, you know, what's going on? You know, what are you doing? And they told me then that it was a investigation, you know, into the death of April.
They felt like that dogs couldn't have done that to her. It was very scary. I couldn't figure it. I couldn't understand how somebody could have come and done that.
Police found April's blood on a fence post and some leaves, but found no other outward signs of any dog attack. There were 3 dogs on the property. 2 belonged to the family, the 3rd belonged to a neighbor. None of the dogs had shown any hint of violence before. In the couple's home, investigators found paraphernalia allegedly linking the couple to the occult.
They thought maybe the cutting of April's leg was a bloodletting ceremony for a cult, and that's why she died, or that's why this was done. And that was one theory that they investigated heavily.
Police also collected an electric curling iron, thumbtacks, and push pins, items suspected of causing the scratch marks and puncture wounds on April's body. Next, they asked the couple repeatedly for the knife.
We were grilled for hours about the knife that was supposedly had made the cut on her leg. Did I have the knife? Where was it?
John's hunting knife was confiscated, and all of the items were sent to the crime lab for analysis. A presumptive test showed possible signs of blood on the knife, and with that finding, John Miller and Debbie Loveless were charged with murder.
The visions that it evoked are just horrendous, of them holding this little girl down, gashing her leg with this knife, I mean, cutting out a large chunk of skin and artery with this knife, and then whacking her repeatedly with this curling iron, and then sticking little push pins in her.
John and Debbie were both given lie detector tests. Debbie passed, but John did not.
The state police and local police held the polygraph against us, saying, well, you flunked it, so you must have done it.
He had failed it, and I couldn't understand. I'd never seen any kind of violence, any kind of anything out of John. And these police officers were telling me that he did this. I couldn't understand it. It made no sense to me. You know, so then I did question, you know, and tried to figure out why.
At the trial, John and Debbie were represented by court-appointed attorneys. One of the lawyers did not want to use the dog attack story as a defense.
The other lawyer came in and said, look, we can't pursue the dog attack. He said the DA threatened us that he could just blow us out of the water. There's nothing there to show dog attack, so basically I have nothing to fight with.
Prosecutors portrayed John as the enraged stepfather who got angry with April, lost his temper, and abused and murdered her. Debbie was portrayed as a battered wife too afraid of her husband to do anything about it. Submitted into evidence was the autopsy report that April had been murdered. and the items from the couple's home which were suspected of causing the wounds.
If you're sitting there listening to them lay out this theory of how they think this crime occurred, I mean, it's a horrendous case. It's horrible to think of them, you know, holding this little girl down and doing this stuff to her.
John's court-appointed attorney, Paul Chitwood, asked the judge for more time to interview prosecution witnesses, and he also requested funds to hire his own forensic expert. Both requests were denied. A defense chemist testified that the original test on John's hunting knife, which found blood, was presumptive. Further testing on the knife showed it wasn't human blood. And no blood was found on the curling iron, the push pins, or thumbtacks. The possibility of a dog attack was never presented to the jury.
In final arguments, one of the defense lawyers admits it was murder, admits that April was murdered by someone, says, you know, she was murdered. I don't know who did it, but the state hasn't proved my client is the one who did it.
The jury found both John and Debbie guilty of murder and sentenced them to life in prison.
The first time that steel door clanged behind me, there is no sound that you've ever heard that sounds like that. It has a distinct sound that will just make your hair stand on end. You know that's not going to open again.
I couldn't close my eyes and see anything except for the way she was when we found her and the way she looked when she died. I didn't sleep for a long time. I thought I was going to be there for the rest of my life.
I had started fighting the day I got in. I had already written to Centurion Ministries, I'd written to the governor, I'd written to the lieutenant governor, I'd written to congressmen. No, I spent more money on stamps than I probably could have had a pretty good meal on it.
When you're put in that position and you're convicted of something that you didn't do, I just lost all hope of anything good ever coming from it, you know, for it ever to be turned around.
I knew I was innocent. I knew Debbie was innocent. And I was not going to stop fighting until I got somebody to prove we were innocent.
As the years passed in prison, Debbie Loveless and John Miller's first concern was for their older daughter, Amy, who was living in foster care. The other concern was finding a way to prove their innocence.
You know, I never knew innocent people went to prison or were convicted for something they didn't do. And I guess I was naive and stupid thinking that it didn't happen. And then when it did, I couldn't believe it. Because I was innocent and they were saying I was guilty.
John and Debbie maintained that April was playing outside and was unclothed because it was a warm day. They believed that one of the dogs attacked April while she was playing. At lunchtime, when they were looking for April, they saw the dogs were agitated. When John followed them into the woods, he found April bleeding profusely from a leg wound. John said April told him that the dogs did it before she lapsed into unconsciousness. But the pathologist who performed the autopsy ruled the death a homicide. Attorney Robert Ardis was assigned to handle the couple's appeal.
Robert Ardis is one of those attorneys that renews your faith in the legal profession. He has a good heart. He won't stop digging until he gets where he thinks he ought to be.
While in the courthouse, sifting through the evidence, Ardis found a box containing hundreds of photographs of April's wounds. Most were autopsy photos, which had been shown to the jury at the trial. But he also found another set of photos taken just after April entered the emergency room. These were photos that had not been shown to the jury, and it wasn't clear whether John and Debbie's original defense lawyers had even seen them. When Artis compared the two sets of pictures, he made a startling discovery. The pictures of April's leg wound were different.
Pictures looked like that a dog had been involved in this death.
Artis sent the photos to a forensic pathologist at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Science in Dallas. After studying the photos, he said that this child had been attacked by a dog.
He said, I can tell you, yeah, it's something with canine teeth. What we were able to show, how a dog's teeth would just overlay exactly on the puncture wounds around where the place had been taken out of her leg.
Dr. Dennis Asen is a forensic odontologist and agrees that animal bites are often difficult to identify. He says that many animal bites don't look like bite wounds at all because animals often tear the flesh rather than biting it.
When you have an injury pattern to determine whether it's a bite mark or not, you need to look at the entire situation to see what other clues and evidence there might be. Is this truly a bite mark or not?
But if dogs had caused April's leg wound, why didn't the original pathologist see this? The answer was obvious. The wound looked different at the autopsy because it had been cleaned and trimmed with a scalpel while the surgeon attempted to repair the wound and save April's life.
When you go into surgery, the wound in this particular instance was very jagged, very uneven, and the surgeon, using a scalpel, will go in and clean the wound up, and they will peel back and get back into fresh tissue there.
And the new team of pathologists noted that many of the scratch marks on April's back consisted of 4 parallel lines. Lines corresponding with the 4 nails of a dog's forefeet.
Here was a paw print. Here was another paw print. I'm told that as long as the person is alive, those particular bruises that had the print of a paw there would not show up. But when she was on her back in the operating room and died on the operating table, then the blood puddled in those places, and it made it very apparent when you looked at them that here was a paw print.
There was now hope for a new trial. After spending 5 years in prison for the murder of their daughter April, John Miller and Debbie Loveless finally had forensic evidence to corroborate their story. That one of the dogs on their property had attacked and killed April. Their new attorney, Robert Artis, also uncovered a written deposition from a woman who had witnessed the dogs on John and Debbie's farm attack 3 different people on 3 separate occasions.
She pointed this out to the sheriff. So the sheriff said, oh, they were just playing.
But the woman wasn't called to testify at the original trial. Armed with this new evidence, Artis requested a new trial. His argument that John Miller and Debbie Loveless did not have adequate counsel at their original trial. Ironically, John Miller's original defense attorney, Paul Chitwood, agreed.
Well, he was pissed off. Nobody likes to be told that they did a bad job officially, and ineffectiveness of counsel basically says that.
Although Paul Chitwood is now deceased, he testified on behalf of John and Debbie at a pretrial hearing, reminding the court he requested and was denied access to the prosecution witnesses before the trial and was denied funds to hire an independent forensic expert to analyze the evidence.
He had always felt that they were not guilty of the crime they were charged with.
The prosecutor's office would not comment on the allegation that some of the photographs in this case might have been withheld from the original defense team. In 1993, a judge dismissed the case against John Miller and Debbie Loveless, citing overwhelming evidence in the couple's favor. After 5 long years, they were finally released from prison.
It was a very poor investigation by law enforcement. They didn't buy the dog attack theory. They didn't look into it.
I couldn't believe it. It was scary because I had been this place for almost 5 years, you know, and I can't even explain it. It's not, I don't think there's words to happiness that I was going home and I was going to see Amy.
The stress and strains of incarceration took its toll. After they were released from prison, Debbie and John separated.
I lost 5 years with my son, with Amy, and with Debbie. You know, they were gone. Debbie was gone. She'd found somebody else, you know, because of trying to get help, and she was gone. So as far as, yes, I was walking out of prison, but my life had basically been destroyed already.
A bad investigation aided by bad science really was kind of frightening to me. This could have happened to you know, any of us.
Just the injustice of everything that was done. You know, how they crucified us for something that we didn't do. And I don't understand why they did it.
In 1995, police in California received an anonymous letter which identified a pair of severed hands as those of a Navy pilot who had been murdered. The letter described the murder in gruesome detail. Investigators searched for some clue to the identity of the author and the killer. San Diego, the second largest city in California, its bay is one of the finest natural harbors in the world and is home to one of the largest naval bases in the country. In 1994, workers at the San Diego Fibers Corporation were sifting through some cardboard in a recycling bin. They made a gruesome discovery. 2 human hands.
First, I wasn't sure that this was legitimate. I thought, you know, a pair of human hands found in dumpsters seemed a little bit strange.
And we collected evidence as if it was a normal homicide with a complete body. This was a little bit different because all we had were hands.
X-rays showed degenerative damage of the joints consistent with an individual over age 60, and the size of the fingers and knuckles indicated they were men's hands. The right hand had one distinctive feature. The thumbnail was missing. Detectives checked local hospitals and morgues to see if they had a body of an elderly man without hands. On the other side of town, Mary Mead and Terry Holland were beginning to worry. They hadn't seen their father, Don Harden, in more than a week.
And I called everybody that I could possibly get a hold of. Have you seen him? Have you heard from him? Nobody had heard anything. So that's at the point where I really got scared, because I thought, where would he have gone?
It's very hard to explain. You go through scared, and then almost an anger, and then worry.
When police learned that Don Harden was missing the thumbnail of his right hand, they knew immediately, and a fingerprint analysis confirmed that the hands were those of 74-year-old retired Navy pilot Don Harden.
It's a shock. I felt that we were in some badly produced police story from TV. I mean, this doesn't happen in real life, and it just really threw us for a loop.
When homicide detectives searched Don Harden's home, they found evidence of robbery. The television, VCR, and microwave oven were all missing. So was Harden's pickup truck. The TV guide was opened to March 28th, which was probably the last day Don Harden was home. Small drops of blood were found in the kitchen, and it appeared that detergents and bleach had been used to wash the kitchen and bathroom floors.
We were under the impression that it was either a missing persons report or a theft involved with a missing person. You never lose hope. You never lose hope.
Don Harden was a widower who had moved to San Diego a few years earlier to be near his daughters. Neighbors described Harden as ornery and difficult, but his daughters remembered him as a loving father.
One of my cherished thoughts that I have of him is that every time I spoke to him on the telephone, at the end of our conversation, I always said, "I love you, Dad," and he'd say, "I love you too, kiddo."
Harden had a history of helping those in need. He often hired homeless men to do odd jobs around his property, and he often let them live in a camper in his backyard.
We were very comforted knowing that there was somebody there in case of an emergency, that my father could be taken care of immediately.
Wow, I think that's really great. There's a guy there that can kind of keep an eye on Dad. He's kind of a companion to Dad, gives him some, someone to talk to. He helps him out. I felt good about it.
Police were on the lookout for the items stolen from Harden's home.
We, in fact, did recover some of Mr. Harden's property. It was, I believe it was a wallet and a driver's license and maybe some Army medals. And we followed that up on that to find out if that would lead back to a suspect. That was kind of a dead end. It was found in a dumpster, and we really couldn't put that back to a viable suspect.
Investigators had no idea what happened to the rest of Don Harden's body, but they suspected something terrible happened inside his home. A pair of severed hands found at a San Diego recycling plant were identified as those of 74-year-old Don Harden, a retired Navy pilot. A search of Harden's home revealed evidence of burglary and violence.
We were in the kitchen, and the kitchen floor had a fine white powdery substance unevenly applied over the whole floor. It was pretty obvious that some cleanser had been used to clean the floor up.
We noticed that there were blood spots throughout the carpet, which led from the kitchen around through the living room and towards the bathroom.
Behind the hamper, detectives found a blood stain and some human tissue inside the heating grate. To find out whether blood had been cleaned up, detectives administered luminol, a chemical which fluoresces when it comes into contact with the iron component of blood, even after it has been removed with water and detergents.
When you spray luminol, it doesn't really hurt the blood itself. It helps you find it. So it doesn't compromise the evidence. It just helps you locate the evidence. It helps you find a scenario as far as what happened. It's a presumptive, it's not a conclusive, but it's a tool that we use.
After spraying the luminol, the lights are extinguished, and the camera with high-speed film captures the images.
It was the largest glow of luminol I had ever seen in my life. It glowed like a Christmas tree.
Police found a huge amount of blood on the kitchen floor, and a blood trail leading from the kitchen to the bathroom. And in the bathroom, there was even more blood. DNA tests revealed the blood was Don Hardin's. The amount of blood led forensic pathologists to conclude that Hardin could not have survived such a devastating attack.
I go over to the couch and we sit down, and he says, there's positive proof that your father was killed in the kitchen and he was dismembered in the bathroom. And he is dead. It's positive proof that he is dead.
It didn't sink in for quite some time. But there's disbelief. There's the question why. What could have possibly provoked it?
Hardin led a simple life in retirement, similar to other naval retirees in San Diego. So who would want him dead? And who would go to such lengths to conceal the murder? The day before he disappeared, neighbors saw Don Hardin with one of the homeless men he allowed to live in his backyard camper. His name was Dale Whitmer, a 41-year-old drifter who had a police record for vagrancy and intoxication, but no past history of violence.
Going out to the car, carrying something wrapped up in a piece of cloth, a bundle, like putting it in the rear seat.
Whitmer denied any knowledge of Don Hardin's whereabouts. Whitmer said that Hardin had loaned him the pickup truck but hadn't seen him since. He said he worked for Hardin on and off for years, and said he regarded the old man almost like a father. But friends and neighbors disputed that.
Dale had told other people, neighbors, that the old man was bothering him and that he was really getting mad and that he was tired of the old man poking him and calling him names and belittling him.
I want you to take your time. I want you to look at it closely.
During the police interrogation, Whitmer was shown a photograph of the severed hands.
They're Don Hardin's hands.
And we asked him how he could know such a thing. And he just said he'd grown accustomed to seeing them over the year that they'd been together, and he just recognized them as being Mr. Hardin's hands.
But Whitmer would say no more. When police asked him to take a lie detector test, he refused. Whitmer's fingerprints were found inside Hardin's home. But since he did odd jobs for Hardin, this wasn't unusual.
Mr. Whitmer was very nonchalant. He talked to us, had an answer for almost every question that we had, and just told us that I don't know where he is. He asked me to do a few things for him. I was driving his truck because he let me. He asked me to take some things from his house and give them to other people, and I did.
With no other leads, the case of Don Hardin's disappearance went unsolved for over a year, until police received an anonymous letter that contained details of Don Hardin's murder that hadn't been released to the public. Forensic evidence indicated that Don Hardin had been murdered inside his home, but all investigators ever recovered were his severed hands. More than a year after Don Hardin's disappearance, police received a tip. An anonymous letter arrived at police headquarters containing details about Don Hardin's murder.
When I read it, I realized that whoever wrote the letter or provided the information for the letter knew something about our crime. There were things in the letter that only a suspect would know. I got real excited about it.
The writer said that his friend, Bob, had identified Don Hardin's killer.
He was murdered by Dale Whitmer. Dale hated Mr. Hardin, who abused him by hitting him with a cane if he didn't work hard enough. Dale's a heroin addict who lived behind Mr. Hardin's home for a year or so before the murder. He put the body into the bathtub, dismembered his body, put it in garbage bags, and buried different bags all over the county and Mexico.
Hardin's dismemberment in the bathtub was the information that had not been released to the public. The letter went on to say that Bob would not come forward to testify against Dale Whitmer.
I asked him to contact you directly, but he didn't feel like he could do it. Bob is convinced that Dale will know Bob is the source of the information and may try to silence him or hurt him in some way.
It was clear that the writer of the letter wanted to help, but did not want to get involved.
Good luck, Detective.
The Forensic Documents Office at the San Diego Police Department analyzed the letter and looked at the postmark for a clue to its origin. The letter wasn't mailed with stamps, but had gone through a postal meter, the type businesses normally use. Each postal meter prints a number on the envelope, which is the meter's registration number. But the writer had covered the number with white ink in an effort to conceal the letter's origin.
We can look at letters for trace evidence, latent evidence, and in this case, obliterated evidence, and quite often find something that would allow us to source that document. But we can't always.
Using what is known as a video spectral comparator, various light sources and filter combinations can often reveal what is hidden underneath ink and markers. The first attempts to see the meter number were unsuccessful. So Hugh Kerfman, the operator of the comparator, tried looking through the opposite side of the envelope by cutting it in half. He then used a blue-green light to penetrate the white ink, and it worked.
So it was a pretty clear image, and Detective Lang looked at it and quickly said, well, there it is.
The number of the meter, 5197451. The initials PB on the postmark indicated the manufacturer, Pitney Bowes. The serial number revealed the state, city, street name, and office address of the postal meter. It was located at Davis Capital Management in La Mesa, California. The owner of the company was Mark Davis, who was also a bishop in the Mormon Church. When confronted by police, Davis admitted that he wrote the anonymous letter. The source of his information was a member of his church. But Davis refused to identify the source further, citing the religious privilege that exists between the clergy and a church member. Prosecutors took Mark Davis to court, and a judge ruled against him.
The religious privilege hurdle is not absolute in the sense that not every communication with a clergyman is protected. In this instance, the judge found that there was actually a good argument that this was not protected by the priest penitent or clergyman penitent privilege.
The court ruled that the information might have been privileged at one time, but once Davis wrote the letter to police, the privilege was broken. Mark Davis complied with the court ruling and identified the source of the information. Bob was Dale Whitmer's own daughter, Andrea.
She was the trickiest, most difficult, most sensitive witness we had to deal with, in that she loved her father, even though he had murdered this man, and that's something that you would expect. She also never expected to be found out, and yet she was, and she was dragged into this.
Dale Whitmer was arrested and charged with murder.
Dale Calvin Whitmer.
On September 15, 1997, Dale Whitmer went on trial for the murder of Don Hardin. He pleaded not guilty. The star witness against him, his daughter Andrea, found herself in a difficult position.
If she lies on the stand to protect her father, she betrays her God. If she tells the truth on the stand, she is true to her religion, but she betrays her father. Which one do you choose if you're Andrea Whitmer?
Andrea Whitmer chose to tell the truth, and she corroborated everything that Mark Davis had written in his letter. The letter said Dale Whitmer was a heroin addict and desperately needed money. Prosecutors believe that on March 28, 1994, Dale Whitmer walked into Don Hardin's kitchen and killed him. The motive was robbery and revenge for past abusive treatment. The luminol evidence suggests that Hardin was bleeding profusely in the kitchen, and the body was dismembered in the bathtub. Traces of blood and human tissue were found behind the hamper on the heating grate. Whitmer later removed the blood evidence with water and detergents, but the iron component in the blood was easily detected by the luminol. Whitmer stole Hardin's TV, VCR, and microwave oven and sold the items to buy drugs. Over time, Whitmer disposed of Hardin's body parts in numerous dumpsters throughout San Diego and Mexico. The hands were the only part of Don Hardin's body ever recovered. The jury found Dale Whitmer guilty of second-degree murder. Don Hardin's daughters asked for permission to address the court before sentencing, which wasn't an easy thing to do.
He almost got away with committing this hideous crime. I am grateful he will be in prison and not able to inflict himself on another family. This ordeal has renewed my faith in the criminal justice system.
Life without my father, and Father's Day is the hardest for me. We really miss him. I find myself still wanting to pick up the telephone and call him.
This is a chilling murder.
Dale Whitmer was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison.
We would have been unable to prosecute him but for the luminol work and, of course, a letter.
It would have been unsolved. There was a probability that we would have known who did it, but we would have never been able to prove it.
Obviously, finding the hands was an important case, but the forensics allowed us to examine the scene and find the amount of blood loss that was there at the scene, the extent of the scene, and obviously the envelope played a very, very big part in this case.
I hope that with all the forensic technology that they have, that anyone that's possibly even thinking of doing any kind of wrongdoing, that they'll stop and think about it before they do it, because with all the forensic technology that's out there, they're going to be caught.
After the trial, Don Hardin's hands were cremated and his ashes were buried by the U.S. Navy at sea off the coast of California.
After it was all over, we just felt so much better. We felt like, okay, it's closed now. Dad's had his proper burial at sea. It's over.
Those were his final wishes, and we carried out those wishes.
During an evening church service, 38-year-old Steve Robards fell ill. He died later that night of a heart attack. 1 year later, while reading Hamlet, Steve Robards' daughter studied the lines of Claudius the King when he says the following about death, jealousy, guilt, and revenge.
My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go.
In these words, a clue to her father's death. The cities of Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas. Locals call it the Metroplex. It's the largest consolidated metropolitan area in the state, known for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dealey Plaza in 1963.
Official now, the president is dead.
38-year-old Steve Robards was a Texas native recently divorced and worked as a mail carrier for the United States Postal Service.
Very proud of his job, which was just a rural route postman, but he liked his job. He liked being outdoors and felt some pride in it.
His 16-year-old daughter Marie had recently moved in with him after a disagreement she had with her mother's new husband.
So they were living in a one-bedroom apartment at this time, and he was on the list to get the next available larger apartment, and he was very happy about having his daughter in his life at this point.
Marie enrolled in Eastern Hills High School, where she was a popular straight-A student.
Quiet, studious, elegant, the kind of girl that sort of you looked at twice and always wanted to get to know because she seemed so reserved, so poised, so intelligent. There was never a flaw about her. I mean, her face complexion was perfect.
By all accounts, both father and daughter enjoyed living together, but their lives changed forever on the night of February 17, 1993. Just after dinner, Steve Robards attended an evening church service. When he returned home, he told his girlfriend and daughter he wasn't feeling well.
After a little while, he started getting stomach cramps, severe stomach cramps, and they became more severe as the night progressed.
Terrible.
After a few hours, ultimately, 911 was called, and he went into what appeared to be a coma-like state right there in the living room.
He began to foam at the mouth and became nauseous. And by the time the ambulance guys got there, he was dead.
An autopsy revealed the death was caused by cardiac arrest.
And I didn't want to believe, how could it be that bad? He was 38. How could it be that serious? He was 38.
His heart was mildly enlarged. It was probably 25% too heavy for a man his age and size. And somewhat uncomfortably, I signed it out as a natural death.
After Steve Robards' death, Marie went to live with her grandparents and transferred to Mansfield High School for a new start.
So for 1 year, Marie lived the kind of perfect life every parent would hope their child would live. She was an excellent student. She never got in trouble. She always turned in her homework. She dated some, but she was never in any way regarded as a wild girl.
After graduation, Marie used the $60,000 she received from her father's life insurance policy to attend the University of Texas. She majored in pre-med. Her dream was to become a pathologist.
Even then, she was one of the most talented of the many freshmen at that sprawling university. There was nothing that suggested anything except she was headed for this kind of excellent life that seemed her destiny.
Midway through her freshman year, Marie learned that police were investigating her father's death. They questioned how a 38-year-old man could have died of a heart attack so young.
It was, by all accounts, the perfect crime.
After Steve Robard's unexpected death, his daughter Marie transferred to a new high school and made a new friend, Stacy High.
I would have to say we were best friends. You know, we kind of fell in love with each other, you know, just, we had so much in common.
Stacy sees in Marie, she sees something in Marie. She sees through her in a way. She realizes that that poise and that perfection is disguising something.
During senior year, Stacy and Marie were both required to read Shakespeare's Hamlet for English class. As they read the play together, Stacy happened to begin with Claudius's soliloquy in Act 3, in which Claudius agonizes over his decision to repent for killing Hamlet's father.
My fault is past, but oh, what form of prayer can serve my
turn. Forgive me my foul murder. That cannot be, since I am still possessed of those effects for which I did the murder.
So Stacy reads the line and goes, "Isn't that cool, Marie, how that's written?" And Marie's standing, frozen, and tears begin to stream down her face.
She asked me, "Stacy, do you think people can go through life without a conscience?"
And there was Stacy with her questions. You have a secret? Yes. You've done something? Yes. And you know, Stacy's first question, "Oh my God, you're pregnant." Marie went, "No, it's worse."
So after a while of guessing, I said, "Did you kill someone?" She nodded her head yes.
And that's when Marie broke down and cried.
I can't talk about this right now.
Marie then admitted the unthinkable, that she murdered her own father. She said she did it with a poison she stole from her chemistry class a year earlier.
Okay, everybody quiet. Working on our last reports today. Be very careful with this stuff. Now, everyone get your notebooks out.
Marie said that she took the poison when the teacher's back was turned, placed it in a paper towel, and hid it in her backpack. One week later, while preparing dinner, Marie mixed it into her father's Mexican food, which concealed the taste of the poison.
There you go.
Thank you, sweetie.
The poison she used mimicked the signs of a heart attack, and her father died a few hours later. The autopsy never detected the poison in his system. After the confession, Marie swore Stacy to secrecy. If the pledge was broken, Stacy knew her best friend would spend the rest of her life in prison.
Stacy is tormented, however, by the secret she too is trying to keep. She asked her mother if she can check into a psychiatric hospital for adolescents. And no one can figure out what had happened to Stacy. It seemed like the classic meltdown.
Stacy knew if she said anything, it would be her word against Marie's, since Steve Robard's death was ruled to be from natural causes. However, the pressure on Stacy High was too great. She told her mother, the school guidance counselor, and eventually the police.
So for 8 months, Stacy kept the secret, and it nearly destroyed her. And she finally had to confess. But Marie never would. And like Claudius, she seemed stuck, trapped in her own private hell.
When Stacy High told police that Steve Robards had been poisoned, the police searched the chemistry lab where his daughter Marie said she stole the poison that killed him. In the lab's safety manual, the page describing the chemical Marie allegedly used had been torn out.
It also tells you what precautions you need to take when using the substance. It also tells you what to do in case it's swallowed or your eyes come in contact with it.
If Marie used a poison to kill her father, why hadn't it shown up during the autopsy?
It's not a normal procedure unless there's some indication that we need to do that. It's a testing that we don't do here at the facility and we have to send out for, and the investigation did not lead us to suspect anything of that nature at the time of the death.
The chemical she used, the only way it could be detected is if the medical examiner in Fort Worth had a machine that cost $150,000 that could detect the trace of this chemical during an autopsy, which they didn't have and which they never even thought of using.
The technology which can find rare chemicals in human tissue is called a mass spectrometer gas chromatograph. Since Marie planned to attend medical school and become a pathologist, prosecutors suspected she was familiar with the screening test used by the local medical examiner. She also knew which poison wouldn't be detected. Investigators hoped that Steve Robards' tissue samples were still in storage since his death 18 months earlier.
The medical examiner's office was within days of destroying the tissue samples and the blood samples, as they do when there's nothing amiss. They don't suspect foul play or homicide.
The tissue samples were sent to an independent forensic laboratory in Pennsylvania, where they were analyzed with the mass spectrometer gas chromatograph. The poison they were looking for was a metallic substance and very rare. We will not reveal the name of the poison on this program. The gas chromatograph mass spectrometer directs a beam of electrons on the sample, breaking its component molecules apart for analysis. The results are charted on a graph. Each peak is a separate compound. The size of the peak is proportional to the amount present. The number is the exact time in minutes it took for the compound to travel through the column from the moment of its injection to detection. In Steve Robards' sample, scientists found a metallic compound with a retention time identical to the poison his daughter Marie admitted stealing from the chemistry lab. And the amount found in Steve Robards' body was massive, 28 times the lethal dose. With this news, Fort Worth homicide detective Thomas Boettcher went to the University of Texas in Austin to see Marie Robards.
She came out in the hallway and I introduced myself. I told her she was under arrest for the death of her father, Stephen Robards, years earlier. She had no response. There was no reaction.
And Marie quietly went with them, poised as ever, and once they got in that little room, they barely had to ask a question, and she confessed and broke down.
And she was pretty forthcoming with information fairly quickly. She didn't try to hide. She apparently was either guilt-ridden or had thought a lot about what she had done and came forward with the information.
The most fascinating aspect for both the police and for journalists covering the case was Marie's explanation of her motive.
What was it that made you want to kill your father? And she said, I wanted to be with my mom.
But in an ironic twist, like something out of a Shakespearean tragedy, it was all in vain, because Marie Robards' mother and her new husband were planning to move to Florida and didn't tell her until after her father's funeral. Marie had no choice but to move in with her grandparents so she could finish high school in Texas.
And thus began this tale that in many ways is a kind of twisted modern parable of teenage girls in the suburbs. These girls that have those mercurial emotions, but also many of whom are girls of divorce who are trying to grow up with parents who have split up and seem often preoccupied with rebuilding their own lives and forget about the needs of their own children.
Despite her confession, Marie Robard surprised everyone by deciding to plead not guilty. She now said she hadn't planned to kill her father at all. In 1996, Marie Robards went on trial for the murder of her father, Steve. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense was that she had no intention of killing him.
Get your notebooks out.
Marie admitted that she stole the poison from her high school chemistry lab. And she also admitted that she put the poison in her father's Mexican food. But she said she only planned to make him sick, not to kill him.
Of course, that doesn't make that much sense. If he just got sick, she wouldn't get to go back with her mother.
Prosecutors said Marie was a straight-A chemistry student, and the amount of poison used was 28 times the lethal dose.
Anybody who's going to go to a local medical school to study is probably, if they're a high school student, is probably above average as far as in the science department. And as a matter of fact, I mean, that was part of my investigation. I collected her grades, and she had very high marks in school and in the sciences.
Are you feeling any better?
I feel lousy. Could you give me some ginger ale?
They also pointed out that Marie stood by and watched her father die without saying a word to her father's girlfriend or the ambulance crew that tried to resuscitate him. 18 months later, the gas chromatography found what the first autopsy did not, that Steve Robards had died of a massive dose of poison. The prosecution presented Marie Robards' signed confession as evidence.
Did you know that this stuff is dangerous? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
How did you know that?
Because my chemistry teacher said
Said what?
that it was dangerous.
And Stacy testified that Marie told her that she always knew that enough of that chemical would have killed her father. And that was this defining moment, that her best friend admitted that Marie had the knowledge about what that poison would do.
The forensic evidence, the confession, and the testimony of her own best friend all worked against her.
The prosecutor in the case called her a relentless predator. Another prosecutor called her society's worst nightmare, a girl who kills her dad. But some people saw her as a kind of Lizzie Borden of Texas. This sweet, charming, successful, industrious young girl who suddenly did something inexplicable. And in this surprising twist, at least for me, I began to sense a sympathy developing for her. Because in many ways, she was the symbol of what modern divorce has done to our society.
The medical examiner says Marie was a very clever killer.
I'll just tell you, she was good enough to fake me out initially, because I, went for the head fake and couldn't find anything.
On May 9th, 1996, it took the jury less than an hour to find Marie Robards guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison.
I don't know what we do about it, but they are kids. They don't think exactly like adults. And that doesn't mean they can get by with something like this with a slap on the wrist, but 27 years seems a little excessive to me.
What she had done was commit the perfect crime. It was, by all accounts, the perfect crime.
Had Dorothy Marie not mentioned it to a friend, she probably would have gotten away with it. I mean, almost certainly would have gotten away with it.
Marie has never spoken about what's happened since. What is known is that Marie is the model prisoner at this women's unit in East Texas, where she's going to be staying for several more years. That she has never complained, that she always volunteers for the worst chores, that one day a psychologist went to see her and she was wearing this paper-thin prison garb, and a cold front had come through Texas. And she was shivering. And the psychologist said, "Why don't you ask for something warmer?" She said, "I don't deserve to." She shrugged, she smiled, and she said, "I'll be okay."
In 1996, a fire broke out in a rental home in North Carolina. One child died. Another was critically injured. To the family, the fire was a mystery. To investigators, it was murder. Tabor City, North Carolina, a small, rural, sweet potato farming community in the western part of the state and home to the Henson family.
Joshua's first Christmas. Merry Christmas, Betty.
Joshua Henson and his sister Brittany lived with their mother Terry and her boyfriend Rodney Strickland. Rodney worked in construction. Terry was a homemaker and student. On October 19, 1996, Rodney left to spend the night with his son in Fairbluff, about 15 miles away. Terry's mother, Bernice, came over to the house that night for dinner.
I was there when she took Brittany and Josh upstairs to bed. And as they were going upstairs to bed, the last words I heard Josh say is, "I love you," because he was just learning to talk.
After Bernice left, Terry plugged in a space heater to heat the home since it was the first cold night of fall. She fell asleep on the sofa in the living room around midnight. At 4 a.m., Terry was awakened by screams from her children. The house was on fire. The thick smoke and flames made it impossible to reach the children. The only thing Terry could do was call the fire department. The police arrived first, and an officer also tried to rescue the children. He too was unsuccessful.
He went kind of past me and got almost to the top of the stairway and said, "We can't get in."
To clear the way, Terry moved the space heater at the bottom of the stairs. By the time firemen arrived, the upstairs was almost entirely in flames. The children were rushed to the hospital, both in critical condition.
It's really hard to recognize her as Brittany. She was black from head to toe. And they told me when I got there they didn't think she'd make it.
Brittany was fortunate. She survived the fire. Tragically, 17-month-old Joshua did not.
They finally came out and said that he didn't make it. But they did ask me if I wanted to see him. They suggested I didn't. But that I could, that, you know, they had to ask. And I didn't.
Yeah, I really loved him a lot. I really loved him like he was my actual child. I loved him like I wanted my baby brother to at least have a long life. Because he did hardly even had a life. He was too young to die.
When the fire was extinguished, local authorities found evidence that the fire started in the children's bedroom closet. At first, they thought that Brittany might have been playing with matches, but when they looked into Terry Hinson's background, they uncovered information which made them suspect it might have been murder. Brittany Hinson, now 8 years old, remembers the horrible fire that burned through her home 4 years earlier.
I was burnt all over, and I had died, and I was up in heaven, and believe me, it's beautiful. And the rivers were rainbow paths and bridges, and were gold, and the houses were made out of clouds, which had the names on top that were of the people that would own them. I'm special because I had died and I came back alive. That's why I think I'm special.
Her younger brother Joshua, just 17 months old, died in the fire.
I just miss him a lot. I wish he hadn't died. I mean, he was so young.
With any kind of house fire, officials try to identify the cause. Generally, a fire burns longest at or near its point of origin, so the room with the most damage is usually where the fire started. Most of the damage was in Joshua's bedroom, which was at the top of the stairs. Investigators found a V-shaped pattern on the wall in Joshua's bedroom closet. It's a pattern that occurs when something combustible is against a wall. This discovery told investigators that the fire started on the closet floor and traveled up to the attic. A melted copper electrical wire was hanging from the attic, which investigators concluded had been burned in the fire and was not the cause of it. Special agents from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms assisted in the investigation. They eliminated the nearby electrical outlet as the cause. And when they couldn't determine how the fire started, they concluded that someone had set it intentionally with a match or lighter.
I was told by the state agent that anyone who was in that house that night was a suspect. Anyone who had been in the house that evening would have been.
Investigators first talked to Brittany to see if she had been playing with matches that night. They were satisfied she had not. Next, they wanted to know where Terry's boyfriend Rodney was at the time of the fire.
Rodney had plenty of alibis. He was back in Fair Bluff with his son, spending the night. Plenty of people saw him.
But investigators were most suspicious of Terry, since she was sleeping on the sofa downstairs when the fire broke out, instead of in her bedroom upstairs. And they also discovered that a few years earlier, she had given 3 older children up for adoption.
The only reason Terry let those children go was because she did love them enough to want the best for them. And at that time, she could not give them anything, not even a home. She didn't have a job, she didn't have a car, she didn't have no money, she didn't have anything.
People made a leap from that event, the adoptions, to somehow that becoming a motive for killing her other child.
Witnesses also told police that at the fire scene, Terry behaved suspiciously.
Her mama said that she had been depressed. Said she had been bringing books over for her to read at night. And her boyfriend said that she would sleep on the couch.
They just didn't think Terry was acting the way a mother would act if a child had been killed in a fire. There was just something wrong to them about it.
She was blamed for the fire. She was blamed that she's the one who did the fire. She didn't do it. She didn't do a single thing.
Terry denied having anything to do with setting the fire.
I was actually the only one considered. They had to eliminate Brittany because she was a child that could have started a fire at that age. Rodney couldn't be considered because he wasn't there. He was 12, 15 miles away.
Police arrested Terry Henson and charged her with murder, attempted murder, and arson. And her nightmare continued when her own lawyer hired an independent investigator who agreed with the prosecution that the fire had been intentionally set.
I mean, it took me a long time to realize my attorney wasn't going to help me. I still held a lot of faith that he was going to do something, and I finally realized, okay, he's not.
If convicted, Terry could face the death penalty. For 61 days, Terry Henson sat in a North Carolina jail cell, waiting to be tried for murder and arson. Eventually, Terry was released on a $200,000 bond, but remained under house arrest. And with no one else to turn to, Terry conducted her own research into the fire that killed her son Joshua. First, with her computer, she made a search on the internet. She typed in the word fire.
I spent several days, probably weeks, looking on the internet for something that would help my case. I didn't understand the internet as far as there being actually people out there that you could talk to. Wasn't sure of how to talk to them if I did know.
It was slow going until Terry found an article written by a fire investigator in Sydney, Australia.
Is it an accidental fire or arson? By Tony Cave.
The article described common mistakes investigators make when determining the cause of a suspicious fire. Specifically, it discussed the role of bias in fire investigation. For example, arson investigators tend to look for arson, and insurance investigators tend to look for insurance fraud. The article recommends that fire investigators have a scientific or chemical background. Terry desperately wanted to get in touch with the author.
I didn't understand email. When I saw the little envelope thing on his page, I clicked on it, and it's, like a blank page pops up for you to type in. So I just assumed, okay, well, I could send this to him. And I still didn't understand how he would get back to me.
The author, Tony Cave, did respond. But since he lived in Australia, he recommended Dr. Gerald Hurst in Austin, Texas. Dr. Hurst earned his PhD in chemistry from Cambridge, and he agreed to look into Terry's case.
Homeowners burning a house down to kill their children, pretty rare, very rare.
Terry sent Dr. Hurst every piece of information she had about the fire. After reading through it, Dr. Hurst was struck by how incomplete the local investigation had been.
I decided to concentrate on the attic precisely because they had said almost nothing about the attic in the investigation report. The attic was a complete revelation.
The insulation in the attic was made of ground-up newspaper treated with a flame-retardant chemical. Dr. Hurst checked local weather conditions, and he discovered that Hurricane Fran had passed through Tabor City, North Carolina, just 6 weeks before the fire. Terry said the torrential rains from that hurricane leaked through the roof and caused water damage in the ceilings. Dr. Hurst also found a melted 50-year-old electrical wire in the attic insulation. Terry told Hurst there had been some electrical problems on the night of the fire. Her curling iron had been going on and off earlier that evening. And when she moved the electric space heater for the firemen, she remembers it was cold to the touch.
I picked it up with both hands, just slid it out of the way. And later is when it dawned on me that that heater should have been very hot. I mean, it had been turned on in full blast.
That meant that the heater had gone off at least a half an hour before she became aware of the fire.
Dr. Hurst and fire investigator Ken Gibson flew to North Carolina to inspect Terry's home firsthand. They did not believe the fire started the way the government investigators said.
Well, it's really very simple. Innocent people are being put into prison or forced into plea bargains for fires they did not start.
After Terry Hinson was charged with arson and murder in the death of her 17-month-old son Joshua, her only hope was a scientist she found through the internet.
Jerry Hurst is one of these guys who kind of comes out of left field and actually saved the day in this case.
The findings of the State Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms rested on the theory that the fire started on the floor of the bedroom closet. And when the cause couldn't be found, they concluded the fire had been deliberately set.
ATF, they call themselves arson investigators. The state call themselves arson investigators. That's what they're looking for, is arson. That's what they train for. That's what they go to school for, is to catch arsonists. What you want is a fire investigator to determine what caused the fire.
Dr. Hurst found evidence that the roof leaked in Terry's rented home, and tests revealed it washed away the flame-retardant chemicals on the paper insulation. He also found evidence of electrical malfunctioning. On the day of the fire, mysteriously, Terry's curling iron was going on and off. And during the fire, when Terry moved the space heater, it was cold to the touch. This indicated the heater had not been on for at least a half hour before the fire. The heater was plugged into a line originally designed for 15 amps. In the fuse box was a 30-amp fuse which had blown out.
That means that you're carrying more power through that wire than it was designed to carry. And when you overload it, it heats, it gets hot.
Cold snap, a 1,500 watt appliance on a line that had probably never seen that high a wattage before. And the question became, did that electrical line over the top of the closet feed the heater? Because if it did, you had a correlation, you had a potential cause and effect situation.
And that is exactly what he found. The cable in the attic fed the outlet used by the 1,500 watt space heater and the curling iron.
And that's what really frosted the cake for us. We had an origin, a cause that could not be disproven scientifically, and we had a connection between the differences in what was done that night and what had been done before. And that gives you a very strong presumptive case for an accidental fire.
Dr. Hurst believes several factors created the chain of events that culminated with the fatal fire. Water from the leaking roof washed the flame-retardant chemicals off of the paper insulation in the attic and further eroded the 50-year-old electrical cable. Over time, as the rainwater hit the exposed portion of the electrical cable, it arced, burning the wooden attic beam and leaving behind char marks or carbon tracks. Wood does not conduct electricity, but carbon does. Dr. Hurst believes that when Terry plugged in the 1,500 watt space heater that night, it heated the electrical wires in the attic, which arced. Those sparks touched a carbon track, which ignited the paper insulation just above Joshua's bedroom closet.
A wooden ceiling with an already well-built fire that suddenly breaks through produces a holocaust in no time at all.
The fiery debris from the attic fell through the hole in the ceiling onto the floor of the closet. and did not start on the floor and burn upwards as local investigators suspected. Ken Gibson believes that the fire officials rushed to judgment.
So anything that doesn't fall into the theory that this was part of how the arsonist started the fire, to them it's not evidence, it's just something that's there.
Dr. Hurst sent the local prosecutor his critique of the government's investigation, which said their conclusions were based on junk science.
Not only is there a badly melted and arced fire, it had arc marks on it, which could have been caused by the fire, but which could also have initiated the fire. No way to tell. And that wire passed across dead center in the hole in the ceiling. Quite a coincidence.
To his credit, the district attorney studied Dr. Hurst's report, conducted his own investigation, and dropped the charges against Terry Hinson. But by the time it was all over, she had lost her home, her child, and nearly her freedom because of an inaccurate conclusion drawn from faulty science.
Fire investigation in general is the swamp of forensic science. In fact, many forensic scientists refuse to recognize arson investigation as a subfield of forensic science.
I think Terry's story in many respects is heroic. She was not a very well-educated woman, although she's extremely intelligent. And she had just enough computer studies at her community college to know that if she was going to be under house arrest, she needed some way where she could put herself out into the world, even if it was only through her computer and email.
There's people sitting in prison that have gone through what I've gone through, but they didn't have the help, they didn't know how to get it, didn't have the money, and that's not fair.
Terry Hinson cherishes her freedom and the time she spends with Brittany. Yet Terry thinks of Joshua every day. What he would have looked like. What kind of person he'd be. Remembering the good times.
I look around and I see him everywhere. We ran and we played and we had the dog to play with. He swung out of his tree. It's not fair.
In 1988, a patient in Southern California collapsed and died of a heart attack in his doctor's office. But like many Hollywood stories, it was pure fiction. Investigators suspected that the patient and his doctor were one of several characters involved in a real-life murder mystery. Dr. Richard Boggs was a Harvard-educated neurologist in Glendale, California, a short drive from Hollywood.
He had been married, he'd had children, had a huge mansion, had for all intents and purposes, the good life. Drove a Rolls Royce, the wife drove a Jaguar.
Early one Saturday morning in April of 1988, Dr. Boggs called 911 to report that a patient had died in his office of an apparent heart attack. He said he performed an electrocardiogram, which appeared normal. But when he momentarily stepped out of the examining room, the patient collapsed on the floor. By the time paramedics arrived at 7:15 a.m., the patient was dead. Dr. Boggs identified the man as 42-year-old Gene Hansen, who he said had been a patient for years. Hansen's identity was confirmed by credit cards and a birth certificate in his wallet. But paramedics were suspicious because the body was cold and rigor mortis had set in. Sergeant James Lowry was one of the first police officers who arrived on the scene.
The arteries or veins that would be in the face seemed to be broken. There seemed to be a blotchiness to it. Having seen lots of deaths, both natural and unnatural death, it was my impression at looking at this body that he had been deceased for quite some time.
The coroner estimated the time of death by comparing the temperature of Hansen's liver with the room temperature. The body temperature drops 1.5 degrees every hour after death.
The temperature of the room was 72 degrees. The temperature of the body was 87 degrees. Based on that, just a rough guess, it would indicate that it was anywhere from maybe 6 to 7 hours since the person had died.
Which meant that Hansen died between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, long before Dr. Boggs had called paramedics.
I told Dr. Boggs, I says, "You're nothing but a liar. I don't believe you. Everything you've told us is a lie."
As the son of a physician, Sergeant Lowry knew something was amiss. Dr. Boggs was a neurologist trained in treating brain and other neurologic problems. So why was he treating a patient for chest pains? And Dr. Boggs' appearance gave no indication that he had performed CPR.
I looked at Dr. Boggs. His clothes were not messy. He wasn't covered in sweat. His hair was still neatly combed. Having done CPR in the field myself, I know how exhausting that is.
There were too many inconsistencies for the police to accept.
I knew that this person hadn't died the way that Dr. Boggs had told us, but I thought there may be some other explanation. I didn't know if this had been some type of a romantic encounter. I didn't know if this had been some type of a drug overdose. I mean, there were other possible explanations for what had gone on here.
And in a search of Dr. Boggs' office, police discovered some unusual devices not found in most medical offices.
What was found during the course of the search warrant phase were various sex toys that were actually within the examination room of the doctor. I mean, the little cabinets with drawers, that was in there while the doctor was seeing patients, which was really kind of a bizarre way to run a business.
Just 2 weeks earlier, police had responded to another incident in Dr. Boggs' office. A man we'll refer to as Bruce Smith claimed that Dr. Boggs attacked him in his office with a stun gun after hours. Since the two met earlier that night at a gay bar, police concluded it was a lover's spat. In recent years, Dr. Boggs experienced both professional and personal difficulties. He lost his medical privileges at several hospitals. He had gone through a divorce and had admitted publicly that he was a homosexual. And police discovered that Dr. Boggs was a regular at clubs specializing in sadomasochism.
You could say that, in a sense, we're outlaws, sexual outlaws. The activities that they engage in are probably not legitimately recognized in the community as consensual play.
Police hoped an autopsy would reveal what really happened in Dr. Boggs' office. Police were stumped when the autopsy confirmed exactly what Dr. Boggs had said caused Gene Hansen's death: non-specific focal myocarditis, a heart ailment. Hansen's body was positively identified by his business partner, John Hawkins.
It's him. It's definitely him.
Hansen and Hawkins owned a clothing company in Columbus, Ohio called Just Sweats.
Lightweight sweats are the hottest for summer.
This is a television commercial for Just Sweats. John Hawkins was a regular performer in the spots.
For 1 week only, lightweight sweats are 30% off on regular prices. Just sweats have great fashion.
It appeared that they had a tremendous go-go business. They had something like 20 clothing stores. They were driving fancy cars, living a very high life.
Gene Hansen's body was cremated and the ashes scattered in the Pacific Ocean. John Hawkins was the sole beneficiary of his partner's estate, which included a $1 million life insurance policy. After the funeral, Hawkins returned to Ohio and then vanished.
He drove his convertible Mercedes to the airport and left it with the top down in Columbus, Ohio, rainy weather, hopped on a plane with now $1 million in cash.
Sometime later, an employee at the insurance company was closing out her file on Gene Hansen and requested a copy of Hansen's driver's license. California driver's licenses include not only a photograph, but also a thumbprint. But the thumbprint on Hansen's driver's license did not match the thumbprint taken in the morgue after his death. The insurance company reported this discrepancy to police. After looking through their files, police discovered that a 32-year-old Hollywood accountant had been reported missing. His name was Ellis Green. When the photograph of Dr. Boggs' patient was shown to Ellis Green's family, they positively identified him. When confronted by police, Dr. Boggs said he was shocked. He said the man who died in his office was a patient for years and had always been known as Gene Hansen. But Lieutenant Perkins took a closer look at Gene Hansen's medical file and found a startling inconsistency. During 3 different office visits, Dr. Boggs performed EKG examinations on Gene Hansen. But when Lieutenant Perkins placed the EKG strips end to end, he noticed ink marks and other printing evidence that showed that the 3 EKG tests were all performed on the same day.
When I placed each of the EKG strips end to end, the broken part of the actual EKG strips all matched perfectly. And the red dye matched up to the other one, and then the end that was only halfway marked with the red dye matched up with the other one that did not have any dye on it whatsoever.
This was evidence that Dr. Boggs had performed just one test. Then he ripped the strip into 3 pieces and wrote a different date on the back of each piece and placed them in Hansen's file.
He had actually goofed them up, which really made our job a whole lot easier. So this was the first time that we could really say beyond a reasonable doubt that this was a phony or forged medical file.
Investigators then decided to take a second look at the autopsy. Ellis Green's blood and tissue samples were sent for more sophisticated testing, including gas chromatography, which can identify hundreds of toxic chemicals in human tissue, but none were found. Next, a second forensic pathologist was brought in to review the initial autopsy findings. The new pathologist noticed signs of discoloration in Mr. Green's face and fingertips, an indication of suffocation. Such discoloration is often very subtle and disappears quickly after death, which is why suffocation sometimes goes undetected. Despite Dr. Boggs' claim of innocence, he was arrested on suspicion of murder. But did he act alone, or was John Hawkins involved? And where was the real Gene Hansen? When investigators looked into Dr. Richard Boggs' background, they discovered that despite his fancy lifestyle, he was penniless. He had recently gone through a divorce and also lost a large amount of money in a failed business venture.
We did this search of his apartment. We found in one of the bathrooms a bathtub filled with not water, but just overflowing amount of bills directed at the doctor.
And when they looked into the Ohio clothing business owned by Gene Hansen and John Hawkins, they found the same thing: huge financial losses.
One of the ways out of their dilemma, you make a lot of money. Therefore, life insurance became a very attractive proposition.
If the murder of Ellis Green was an insurance scam, investigators were certain Dr. Richard Boggs, Gene Hansen, and John Hawkins were all involved.
I don't know how they met. I know that both Hawkins and Hansen had been patients of Dr. Boggs, and they'd known each other for many years.
Plans for Hansen's staged murder may have begun a full year earlier. Phone records show the trio was in constant communication.
The phone records set up for us the conspiracy. Every time they prepared to do something in this case, you saw an increase in phone activity between all three individuals.
After buying a $1 million insurance policy, Gene Hansen told his friends and colleagues that he was dying of AIDS, which wasn't true. And he said he was moving to California. Before he left, he made John Hawkins the sole beneficiary of his estate, eliminating his family from his will.
This is a case that involved elaborate planning to make sure there's no mistake that some bereaved relative of the true Mr. Hansen, such as his mother, doesn't show up and say, "Wait a second, this ain't my kid."
Police believe that Hansen and Boggs met Ellis Green in a North Hollywood bar. Green was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and he filled all the requirements they were looking for. He resembled Hansen, was HIV positive, and was very, very drunk.
From what we know, Green was a very affable, friendly man, and they probably invited him to join them, and he went along with them, and not having any clue as to what his fate was going to be.
At the very moment paramedics were attempting to resuscitate Ellis Green in Dr. Boggs' office, a man matching Gene Hansen's description checked into this hotel just 2 blocks from Boggs' office under an alias. Later, the real Gene Hansen received a telephone call from John Hawkins in Ohio. And when Ellis Green was pronounced dead, John Hawkins flew to California from Ohio, identified Green's body as that of his partner, Gene Hansen, had the body cremated, and collected the $1 million from the life insurance policy. Then Hawkins and the real Gene Hansen both vanished, leaving behind their bankrupt clothing company and Dr. Richard Boggs to defend himself against murder charges. The hunt for Gene Hansen and John Hawkins would take more than 3 years and lead halfway around the world. As Dr. Richard Boggs sat in a California jail for the murder of Ellis Green, his conspirators, Gene Hansen and John Hawkins, were still on the run. A tip led police to this house in Florida, and a fingerprint found on a drinking glass positively identified Gene Hansen as the resident. but evidence inside the home indicated Hansen had fled the country. A few months later, Hansen was arrested at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport after arriving on a flight from Mexico. Security personnel noticed he was behaving suspiciously. The scars from numerous plastic surgeries and hair transplants were still noticeable. He denied he was Gene Hansen, and he had Ellis Green's driver's license in his possession. He also had several false IDs and a book entitled How to Create a New Identity. His fingerprints matched those of the real Gene Hansen, and he was arrested. Finding John Hawkins was much harder.
John Hawkins was a chameleon. He could schmooze his way into any lifestyle, to any location, plus he had money to assist along the way.
For 3 years, Hawkins used the insurance money to travel the world.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted.
In Amsterdam, a woman saw a television program in which John Hawkins was identified as being wanted in connection with the murder of Ellis Green. The woman was one of Hawkins' former lovers. With information she provided, authorities found Hawkins off the coast of Sardinia in a red catamaran called Carpe Diem, seize the day.
When they confronted him, John Hawkins was a very nasty individual. He said, "What? I'm not who you think I am. I'm Bradley Bryant. I'm an English citizen. Here's my passport." He presented a legitimate British passport, and that he accused them of making a terrible error as to his identification.
John Hawkins was positively identified through fingerprints. Prosecutors believe that financial problems brought Boggs, Hansen, and Hawkins together in an insurance scam which would net them $1 million. Dr. Boggs' assignment was to identify and murder a look-alike for Gene Hansen. His first target was Bruce Smith, whom Boggs picked up in a gay bar, took him back to his office, and attacked him with a stun gun. But Smith escaped. Two weeks later, Dr. Boggs was joined by Gene Hansen, and together they tried it once again. Boggs and Hansen met Ellis Green at a nightclub sometime around midnight. Green had a blood alcohol level of 0.28 and was very drunk. Boggs and Hansen took him back to Boggs' office and attacked him with a stun gun.
Okay, you just get out of here. I can handle this. We'll talk.
But Dr. Boggs made numerous medical mistakes, which were his downfall. He killed Green sometime after midnight, but he didn't call emergency personnel until 7 a.m. By the time they arrived, the body was cold and rigor mortis had set in. John Hawkins, Gene Hansen, and Dr. Richard Boggs were charged with murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and grand theft. At the trial, prosecutors presented forensic evidence that Ellis Green had been suffocated by Dr. Boggs, and the real Gene Hansen was in town on the day of the murder, checking into a nearby hotel just as the paramedics arrived. The defense argued that Ellis Green died of natural causes, primarily due to the extremely high level of alcohol in his bloodstream. But the jury didn't agree. Dr. Boggs and Jean Hansen were convicted of murder and conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. John Hawkins was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud and sentenced to 25 years to life.
I think it was a great result. I think we brought 3 men to justice thanks to great investigators, great experts, and people who pulled together from all over the world.
Solid police work and forensic evidence helped solve one crime and may have prevented another. Investigators discovered evidence that the trio was planning another murder, this time a Hawkins look-alike, in order to cash in on another $1 million life insurance policy. In 1992, 2 masked gunmen broke into this home on the Tyendega-Mohawk Territory in Canada. The motive was robbery, but there was a struggle. Shots were fired, leaving 54-year-old Ward Maracle critically injured. It took solid police investigation and some fancy footwork to identify the perpetrators. The Tyendega-Mohawk Territory is a small community about 2 hours east of Toronto, Canada. The territory was founded over 200 years ago when the Mohawk moved here from upstate New York. The homes and landscape of the area are no different from any other North American community, but the sense of family among the Mohawk is especially strong.
It doesn't appear to be any different than anywhere else in Canada or the U.S. In what I would call, for lack of a better term, mainstream culture. But like I say, the difference is in the people.
In this community, there's a lot of blood family, but even if you're not related, you know everybody pretty close, so it's like being family.
Ward and Diana Maracle were respected members of the community. Ward's Gas Bar, the Maracle's business, a gas station with a restaurant attached, had always been a prosperous business. At night, they also operated a check cashing service from their home for people who didn't have an ATM card.
Everybody knows Ward and Diane, there as well, have contact with them. They're good people.
At Christmas time, residents of the reserve celebrate the holiday just like any other community, with Santa Claus, Christmas lights, and prayer. But in the early morning hours of December 30th, 1992, the holiday spirit of the community was shattered.
Talk to you.
Just before dawn, 2 masked gunmen broke into the Maracle's home.
Ward, we're coming to see you.
went upstairs, woke Ward and Diana, and demanded money.
Where's the money? Give me the money.
One was holding a .22 caliber pistol, the other a piece of wood.
Just shut up and give me the money.
Ward resisted. Shots rang out. By the time it was over, Ward had been shot 3 times. The second perpetrator took Diana downstairs. Fearing for her life, Diana handed over the money they had on hand, $10,000 in cash. And the intruders quickly fled.
We've got a shooting down here on the reserve. We'll need an ambulance. Please hurry.
Okay, ma'am.
Ward Maracle was rushed to the hospital with a bullet wound to his head. He underwent emergency surgery. Most wounds to the head are fatal. Since the gunman wore masks, all Diana could tell police was that the assailants made their getaway in a red car. A few miles down the road, police found the 2 masks used in the robbery. One was a wool ski mask, the other a rubber Halloween mask. Inside the Maracle's home, police found 3 shell casings which were collected for analysis.
The caliber. In this case, I believe they were .22 short caliber. The fact they're out on the ground would indicate that more than likely a semi-automatic pistol as opposed to a revolver was used.
Since the stairs had no carpet and with snow outside, investigators suspected that the perpetrator's wet feet might have left latent shoe impressions on the stairs. The stairs were dusted with fingerprint powder, and immediately, a clear impression of a running shoe was evident. Outside the house, forensic experts found a trail of evidence in the snow, which they hoped would lead them to the perpetrators. During the Christmas holidays in 1992, residents of the Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory learned the terrible news that one of their most prominent citizens, Ward Maracle, had been the victim of a senseless shooting. There is very little violent crime in this small community of 2,600 people.
Shock initially that something of this magnitude could happen in a community such as this.
Take it easy.
Ward Maracle was shot 3 times by a .22 caliber pistol. One of the bullets entered his head. But he was fortunate. He survived. But the injury would leave him permanently disabled. Forensic scientist Jim Eady inspected the crime scene. He noticed a piece of wood on the kitchen table. Diana Maracle told police one of the perpetrators held the wood in his hand during the robbery. When Eady walked outside, on the side of the house he found a wooden sawhorse with one of the legs missing. It appeared that the perpetrators took the leg from the sawhorse and used it to break through the front door. Next to the sawhorse, clearly visible in the bright December sunshine, was a footprint in the snow.
And when I looked, I could see footprints in the area of the sawhorse. I was certain that somebody had gone back behind the house and got the sawhorse and ripped a leg off. There was a potential piece of very important evidence.
Jim Eady realized he had to act quickly before the snow melted and before anyone else walked through the crime scene. His first order of business was to photograph the footprints. These stills would be important, especially if he was unable to make a cast of the footprint. He then rushed to his truck and looked for materials to make a mold. There are a number of techniques for capturing a footprint impression in the snow. If you choose the wrong one, the impression could be lost forever.
Snow presents interesting problems because if you use conventional casting materials, such as dental plaster, it's really very heavy. Dental plaster hardens to stone. And if you pour it into snow, it tends to collapse the footprint because of the weight.
Detective Eady decided on a technique called sulfur casting. He took a small burner and a pot and heated the powdered sulfur. It takes about 15 minutes before it melts into a thick brown liquid. It's then cooled to the point above crystallization. As it poured into the snow, the sulfur recrystallizes immediately and hardens, retaining the important details needed for identification. The impression was from a pair of Nike Air sneakers size 8. The shoe was relatively new, with very little wear. In the impression were some important clues about the perpetrator, details called accidental characteristics.
And the part of the shoe that's going to be rubbing against the road and against the sidewalk and that has those accidental characteristics that we're going to be looking for. And an accidental characteristic is not just a little point. Oftentimes it's like a mini piece of art.
Eady noticed 3 small cuts all in a row on the sole, as if the wearer had stepped on a small piece of wire. In all, Jim Eady identified 10 accidental characteristics in the shoe impression. These would distinguish this particular shoe from the thousands of other Nike Air size 8 running shoes that were in circulation. Not surprisingly, the shoe impression in the snow matched the shoe print on the wooden steps inside the home.
We'd recovered some very good evidence. We had shoe prints. We had brass casings. The difficulty is, unlike fingerprints, which can be searched on a computer and identified, in the case of bullet casings or shoe prints, you need a suspect.
But finding a suspect would not be easy. The robbery and shooting of Ward Maracle on the Tyendinaga Mohawk Reserve was widely covered by the media in the surrounding areas. 2 days after the shooting, an anonymous telephone call suggested police look into the whereabouts of Peter Benedict and Frank Lanoux in the early morning hours of December 30th. Both men were 21 years old. Both had criminal records. Benedict lived in Cornwall, which is about an hour's drive from the reserve. Police had no fixed address for Lanoux. Police went to Peter Benedict's apartment armed with a search warrant. Outside Benedict's apartment, police noticed a red car, similar to the one Diana Maracle identified as the getaway car. Peter Benedict denied any involvement in the crime and said he didn't know where Frank Lanoux was. Inside Benedict's apartment, police found a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber used in the shooting. They also found a number of pairs of running shoes, but none were the Nike Air model size 8 like the impressions found at the crime scene. Police also found $2,500 in cash, and Benedict was wearing what looked to be a very expensive ring. In Benedict's bedroom, police found a receipt for the ring. It was purchased on December 31st, just hours after the robbery at the Maracles' home. The ring was purchased with $1,100 in cash from a jewelry store in Ottawa.
We went out to the car and we searched the vehicle after that, And in the trunk, I found an Aldo shoebox. So I'm thinking, well, Aldo shoebox, brand new running shoes, brand new ring, I'm going to Ottawa, because there has to be a story to be told in Ottawa, and I wanted to hear the story.
Once he got to the mall, Rick Myers discovered that there were a number of shoe stores in the mall. He patiently visited each one, asking store employees if they recognized Benedict or Lanoux as a recent customer.
Hey, you work here?
Yeah.
The last store that he visited was a Foot Locker, and he got a break.
You seen him? I think he came in a couple days ago, actually.
The store clerk recognized Peter Benedict from the mugshot. He said Benedict bought a pair of running shoes just a few days earlier. And he recalled that Benedict wore the new shoes out of the store and left his old pair behind.
He just simply gave up the old ones for garbage and just wore his new ones home. I asked if he would check to see if the old ones were still around. He told me that no, the garbage had gone out the Friday. I was insistent that he go and recheck, because it's always good to recheck everything, particularly when you're so close in this type of investigation to getting something that you really want.
Fortunately for investigators, the trash hadn't been removed from the back room. And in the trash bin, the clerk found the sneakers Benedict left behind.
He did, and sure enough, he comes back dangling the shoes and a very nice smile on his face, and it was an even bigger one on mine.
They were size 8 Nike Air Charcoal high-top basketball shoes, but were they the ones worn to the crime scene? When Jim Eady analyzed the shoes from the trash bin, he discovered the shoe had 10 accidental characteristics, which were in the same location, the same shape and size as those found on the shoe impression in the snow and on the steps. Investigators now knew that Peter Benedict took part in the robbery.
Okay, here we are, Norm.
But was he the shooter? And where was Frank Lanoux?
Just shut up, I want the money.
Could the mask somehow identify who pulled the trigger? Within a week of the robbery and shooting of Ward Maracle on the Tyendinaga Mohawk Reserve in Canada, police had 2 suspects, Peter Benedict and Frank Lanoux. Peter Benedict was already in custody, and Frank Lanoux voluntarily came into police headquarters for questioning. Both denied any involvement in the crime. But the evidence against Peter Benedict was mounting quickly. The shoes he left at the shoe store were positively identified as the shoes which left the print on the Maracle stairway and in the snow print outside their home. Next, Benedict's .22 caliber gun was tested by ballistics.
This pistol here, it's a Beretta, model 950B. It's a semi-automatic pistol, .22 short caliber, which is really the smallest caliber that's used in handguns. It doesn't look like much. It's just a .22. They'll kill you just as dead as the bigger calibers will.
The bullets recovered from Ward Maracle in the operating room were too badly damaged for forensic analysis.
.22s, when they hit bone on headshots, are usually useless. They're projectiles. They'll break up very, very badly.
So investigators used the spent shell casings found in the Maracle's home for comparison. Benedict's gun was test-fired in the ballistics laboratory. The act of pulling a trigger causes the firing pin to strike the primer, which ignites the powder, propelling the bullet through the barrel. Simultaneously, the spent shell casing is pushed back with equal force. Just as the bullet is marked by its passage through the barrel, so is the shell as it comes into contact with the metal surfaces of the weapon's firing and loading mechanisms. Firing pin impressions are as unique as a fingerprint. The firing pin impressions on the shell casings test fired from Benedict's gun were identical to the impressions on the 3 shell casings found inside the Maricles' home.
It's still you looking at it in your training and your experience that causes you to reach a conclusion. And in this case, what I saw and my predecessor saw, whom I trained, indicated to us, yes, those cartridge cases were fired in that gun and no other.
The money found in Peter Benedict's apartment had numbers written by hand on the bundles. They matched Diana Maricles' handwriting. Not surprisingly, inside Benedict's car on the driver's side were Peter Benedict's fingerprints. But on the passenger side were Frank Lanew's. The last challenge for investigators was to discover which one of these 2 suspects was the shooter. Diana Maricles said the gunman was wearing the wool ski mask. The man in the rubber mask held the piece of wood. Scientists were able to identify traces of saliva and mucus inside the masks, and from that, they were able to generate a DNA profile of the individuals who wore each mask. When police compared the DNA of Frank Lanew and Peter Benedict, they discovered that Peter Benedict's DNA was inside the rubber mask, and that Frank Lanew's DNA was inside the wool mask. This identified Frank Lanew as the shooter. When Peter Benedict and Frank Lanew learned about the overwhelming forensic evidence against them, they both pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and robbery. They were each sentenced to 6 years in prison. Ward Maricle eventually recovered from his injuries after a long and difficult rehabilitation. Published reports say he still has lingering problems resulting from the head injury. He and Diana still live and work on the Mohawk Reserve. To this day, Ward and Diana Maricle refuse to talk about what happened in the early morning hours of December 30th, 1992.
It was a great case. It was a classic. One of the many highlights of my career. I enjoyed that case. It was a very exciting day for me when I saw those running shoes come waltzing out from behind the back room.
I believe that the shoe print evidence that we were working with was very strong evidence, and it was very strong evidence at the preliminary hearing, and I think, I feel like I'm bragging.